The Dollar War. Podcast Script, Episode 3 of 3. Part 4. The Chinese Gamble, 11 Jinping's Financial Cold War, and the Risk of Losing It. Every empire that tried to dethrone the dollar failed. China is trying anyway, for reasons that have nothing to do with investment returns. What China actually needs to win. Strip away the geopolitics and look at the requirements for yuan internationalization with clinical precision. For any currency to achieve reserve status, it must satisfy 4 conditions simultaneously. Condition 1, full convertibility. Reserve currencies can be freely exchanged for any other currency at any time without government restriction. The yuan is not fully convertible. China maintains capital controls that limit the flow of money in and out of the country. These controls exist for good reasons from a Chinese perspective. They prevent destabilizing capital flight during economic stress, but they are fundamentally incompatible with international reserve currency status. Eliminating them would expose China to financial vulnerabilities it is not willing to accept. Condition 2, deep, liquid financial markets. The dollar is trusted globally partly because U.S. Treasury markets are the deepest, most liquid markets in the world. Any amount of treasuries can be bought or sold at any time without moving the market significantly. China's domestic bond markets, while large, are not comparably liquid or accessible to foreign investors. Condition 3, rule of law and institutional credibility. Reserve currency holders need confidence that their assets cannot be arbitrarily seized, regulated away, or subjected to political interference. This is where China faces its deepest structural challenge. Xi Jinping's centralization of power, his elimination of term limits, his sidelining of technocratic policymakers, his campaign against the private sector, has raised fundamental questions about the predictability and reliability of Chinese financial governance that no payment infrastructure can resolve. Condition 4, network effects. The dollar is used because the dollar is used. Oil is priced in dollars. Commodity futures are settled in dollars. Most international debt is issued in dollars. Changing this requires not just a better alternative, it requires coordinating the simultaneous change of millions of contracts, relationships, and market conventions. The coordination problem is enormous. China has made meaningful progress on the infrastructure elements. CIPS volumes are growing, ECNY pilots are expanding, bilateral swap agreements are proliferating. But it has made essentially no progress on convertibility, limited progress on financial market depth, and negative progress on institutional credibility under Xi. The Xi dilemma, why he cannot do what he needs to do. Here is the central paradox of China's monetary ambitions. The reforms required to make the yuan a credible international reserve currency, full capital account liberalization, genuine rule of law, reduction of state intervention in financial markets, transparency of government finance, are precisely the reforms that Xi Jinping's political project requires him not to make. Capital account liberalization would expose China to the kind of speculative attacks that destroyed the Thai baht in 1997 and the Russian ruble in 1998. In a Chinese political system where economic stability is the primary basis of CCP legitimacy, that vulnerability is intolerable. Genuine rule of law would constrain the party's ability to direct economic resources for political purposes, which is the party's primary method of maintaining control over the economy. Reduced state intervention would accelerate the relative decline of state-owned enterprises in favor of private firms, which she has reversed as a deliberate policy choice, not an oversight. Transparency of government finance would reveal the scale of local government debt, variously estimated at 70 to 296% of GDP depending on what is counted, in ways that would be devastating for market confidence. China is caught in a trap of its own construction. It wants the international credibility that comes from a reserve currency, but it cannot accept the domestic vulnerability that building one requires. The Japanification risk, the scenario no one wants to discuss. The scenario that deserves more attention than it receives is not Chinese collapse, it is Chinese stagnation. Japan, in 1989, was the world's second largest economy with the world's highest stock market valuations, a current account surplus that seemed unstoppable, and serious predictions that it would overtake the United States within a generation. The Japanese yen was being discussed as a potential challenger to dollar dominance. Then the asset bubble collapsed. Interest rates were cut to zero, then below. Quantitative easing was invented. Demographics deteriorated. Growth never fully recovered. 35 years later, Japan's stock market only returned to its 1989 peak in 2024. China's current economic structure has uncomfortable similarities: massive property sector debt, deflationary pressure, demographic decline, working-age population already shrinking, local government debt that cannot be transparently acknowledged, and a private sector that has been systematically discouraged from the risk-taking that drives productivity growth. If China enters a sustained period of below 4% growth, entirely plausible under current structural conditions, it does not collapse. It stagnates. And a stagnating China cannot finance the Belt and Road lending, the BRICS infrastructure investment, the military modernization, and the technological self-sufficiency program simultaneously. The resources are finite. The ambitions are not. Financial Cold War, the inevitable structural outcome. The US-China financial confrontation will not look like the US-Soviet Cold War for a simple reason: the economic interdependence is far too deep. In 1960, US-Soviet trade was effectively zero. In 2026, despite all the decoupling rhetoric, US-China bilateral trade remains in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Apple still manufactures iPhones in China. Chinese factories still dominate global supply chains for electronics, chemicals, solar panels, and batteries. Fully decoupling these supply chains would take decades and impose costs on both sides that neither can fully absorb. What we are getting instead is something more ambiguous and, in some ways, more dangerous: selective decoupling in critical technologies, semiconductors, quantum computing, advanced manufacturing, combined with continued deep interdependence in consumer goods and commodities. The financial dimension of this looks like two parallel systems gradually developing alongside each other, not replacing each other, but creating an increasingly bifurcated world where countries aligned with the United States primarily use dollar SWIFT infrastructure. Countries aligned with China, Russia, or seeking to avoid sanctions use CIPS BRICS infrastructure. Countries in between, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Turkey, navigate both systems simultaneously, extracting maximum advantage from the competition. This is not the dollar winning. But it is also not the dollar losing. It is something more complex, a fragmenting financial world in which the costs of doing business, the friction of navigating multiple incompatible systems, the risk of being caught in the crossfire of financial weapons, rise for everyone.